All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to ITIF's webinar, How AR/VR Can Revolutionize the Way Businesses Market and Sell Products. My name is Juan Londoño. I am ITIF's Augmented and Virtual Reality Policy Analyst. And today I have the privilege to be alongside an amazing group of panelists, which I would like to introduce now. First, we have Will Duffield. Will is a policy analyst at the Cato Institute Center for Representative Government, where he studies speech and internet governance. His research focuses on the web of government regulation and private rules that govern American speech online, and he has recently looked into how these issues might apply to the metaverse. We also have Ugoma Nwanko. Ugoma is a senior associate at the Global Council, where she leads on U.S. tech policy coverage prior to joining Global Council. Ugoma was a researcher at the Center for Global Development, where she executed projects and technology policy issues, including, but not limited to, data protection and privacy, cross-border data flows, and digital trade. Will, Ugoma, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks. Now that we've introduced both our panelists, let's start the discussion. Augmented and virtual reality technology has continuously been adopted by companies as a method to market and to sell their products. Nowadays, if you open the camera functionality on social media applications, such as Instagram or Snapchat, it could be common to find a promotional filter that allows you to try a pair of sunglasses or maybe some makeup products. Retailers like Amazon, Shopify, Target, or IKEA, among others, give you the option to view how the furniture you're looking for looks in your room with the Try It with AR buttons. Meanwhile, companies like Walmart, Wendy's, or Chipotle have created branded worlds in virtual reality platforms, and automakers continue to deploy VR-powered test drives. This example shed light on how AR/VR has established itself as a powerful tool for companies to sell and market their products, which is impressive considering how relatively young these technologies are. It is reasonable to think that companies are just scratching the surface of the technology's potential, and we might see new uses of AR/VR that we cannot possibly imagine right now. But despite the technology's potential to change how companies present their products to potential customers, certain groups have voiced various concerns about possible negative effects that could arise from implementing this tech. For example, there are concerns, and some more valid than others, that the metaverse might lead to consumer manipulation, deceptive advertisement practice, or the erosion of user privacy. The discussion we are hosting today will try to tackle these questions and see how existing regulations around advertising and tech are well suited or not for the adoption of immersive technologies. Before we start with individual questions, I want to remind all those watching the webinar to subscribe to ITIF's YouTube channel and to turn on notifications so you never miss an event. Also, you can submit your questions using the Slido link below, which can be found in the description of the YouTube video or below our ITIF event webpage. So, Will, I would like to start with a question for you. Currently, one could reasonably state that AR/VR tech has cemented itself as a powerful tool in advertising, even though AR/VR has not become an everyday use mainstream product. What do you think online advertising and marketing would look like in the future when we have these devices in our day-to-day lives?
So, as or if this technology gains more widespread adoption, firms will move from using VR advertising or VR for advertising to advertising in VR. And although these might sound like the same thing, they're really quite different. At the moment, firms tend to market or advertise with VR by creating boutique experiences to showcase their products. Users can come to the Horizon Wendyverse to celebrate Wendy's and enjoy Wendy's-themed games, or join the Lockheed Martin DC to Mars VR bus tour to see Lockheed Martin's vision of interplanetary travel. However, going forward, users will view ads and marketing materials much more incidentally in VR as they use the technology in their everyday lives. A billboard within a VR world that you might encounter while playing a game or socializing with friends in VR. A billboard in the background as you view art with an AR app on your phone. That sort of incidental marketing that we tend to see, or advertising that we tend to see in the real world today, but hasn't really made its way into the VR space yet. That will come with normalization and mass adoption. But right now, the ad or marketing material needs to be sort of the product in itself to get people into VR because they aren't spending their time there anyway.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks, Bill. And then I have a particular question for Gonza is, advertising is currently a highly debated topic in that 2D social media space. And without a doubt, the conversation would likely carry on as we move into a more metaverse-driven digital economy. Global Council recently released a report on metaverse regulation that touches on this subject, which, by the way, I highly recommend our viewers to read. What would you say are the challenges and concerns unique to advertising in this space?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Juan, Global Council released a report on regulating the metaverse, which brought together the perspectives of experts in the space, the broader public in the US, the UK, and the EU, as well as the perspectives of regulators. And in our research, privacy and data protection was identified as a common area of anxiety, regardless of whether we were speaking with members of the general public or experts. Now, one widely cited example was the deployment of eye tracking technologies in VR and AR hardware devices, which introduced significant scope for mass collection and processing of biometric data. And several of the experts we interviewed speculated whether such technology could be abused to create far more intrusive, unsolicited, and highly targeted advertising because of the massive troves of data being collected. So this is a landscape that marketing and advertising professionals have to navigate. How do you advertise in this immersive space that fundamentally transforms the world of marketing? And I think that it really changes the tactics traditionally used by industry while also introducing many new challenges and risks to consumers. How do you balance your business needs with consumer protection? And another point of concern raised by some of the experts that we interviewed has to do with virtual product placement. Everything in the immersive world will feel so real. How will users be able to distinguish between what's actually their reality versus what's been injected into their surroundings and as a form of advertising? If consumers aren't able to easily distinguish between authentic experiences and targeted promotional content, I think that there's a real risk here that if left unchecked, advertising in this immersive world, the metaverse, will become predatory because users will believe that specific products or services are popular in their VR or AR community when in fact they're just seeing promotionally altered representation of their environment. So whether it's the privacy and data protection angle or the product placement angle, there is a risk of consumer trust being undermined if advertising in the metaverse or immersive experiences doesn't strike the right balance. And I think that we know that if consumers have low trust in the technology, they're not going to use it, which ultimately impacts the rate at which this technology is taken up.
Yeah, great, Roma. Thank you so much. So I'd like to open up the discussion with something that we'll touch on. It's like we're already seeing like brands aggressively moving into AR VR marketing, and we've seen some applications like mode-based AR marketing or AR mirrors that have been proven to be useful. For example, companies like Shopify recently indicated that sellers on the platform that use 3D and AR VR and AR models have an average 94% increase in conversion rates. So, Will, what do you think makes AR VR tools more compelling than this traditional advertisements and promos? And do you think, for example, like a clothing brand, could it realistically replace the physical store experience?
So I think clothing is more difficult. Furniture really feels like the lowest hanging fruit here because it's something that even when you view it in store, while you can get touch and feel, you can't see how it's going to look in your house. But being able to via AR place it in your living room without backbreaking labor and move it around, I think helps to increase customers' confidence in their purchases. Um, in terms of clothing, again, not having that kind of feel, heft, those qualities are important as we clothe ourselves. But obviously, the ability to try things on is game changing. Whether you ever get to the point of, I don't know, receiving swatches in the mail along with your AR try on session, I'm not quite sure. But I think, again, when we're thinking about larger expensive physical goods, which it's currently very hard to showcase or try out at home, we see the most gains to be had by using this technology.
Yeah, and yeah, and I think that you can relate a little bit what Ugam was talking about, like how you're present in the content, and that field of embodiment. I think like it can possibly affect how we reach with this advertisement techniques, like especially in spaces like VR, like I almost mentioned, like when we're present there and we can be impacted by it because we are immersed in it. It can definitely. I think that's going to be a very interesting development, and see how this product might evolve to that. So Ugama, I wanted to also ask you in general, like as when we think AR VR marketing, I think it's easy to see those use of AR VR, and AR filters, or like we try with AR functionalities that we'll be touching on. But we're seeing this more brands expand on to more VR and more innovative ways, as like branded metaverse worlds or digital twins, digital replicas of their store. Certain schools are making digital replicas of the universities to lure in more students. So what do you think, from what you research with Global Council, like what AR VR innovations do you think might be introduced in the future? Which industries could be like the ones that could benefit the most? And how do you think consumers can benefit from these tools?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think an innovation that we can expect to see introduced or take off in the future is visual search for AR, similar to what the Google Lens app does today, where you can walk down the street and see apparel or other products in the store window, or even on the street worn by people passing by. Whether it's your phone or your glasses, you would be able to see what the product is, how much it costs, perhaps even purchase the product right away. Aside from that, I think that we're probably also going to see increased use of AR and VR in demonstrating the impact of sustainable choices across the supply chain. So, for example, there was a study conducted by the University of Amsterdam, and what they essentially did was they created a virtual reality supermarket where participants were able to interact with pop-ups, displaying impact messages when they picked up certain products, and these were messages that displayed the environmental or health impact of the product. And what they found was that these impact messages ultimately resulted in behavior change, where people opted to select, the more environmentally friendly or sustainable food choices. I also think that there's an interesting question of whether virtual shops will remain just virtual retail shops, or whether they will end up becoming more social, and this in turn becoming how companies sell good. So in essence, right, will they become like fan experiences? Will fans of, let's say, H&M all meet and socialize virtually while trying on H&M clothes at the H&M virtual store? I think it will certainly be interesting to see if this shift really occurs. To your point on who are the beneficiaries, I would say that the industries that benefit the most are definitely retailers, manufacturers, and wholesalers. And from a consumer perspective, I think that they benefit because these tools really allow them to make informed decisions, as we already talked about. I think it reduces buyer's remorse because they feel more confident in their purchase up front. But it also grants consumers the gift of convenience, right? They don't have to spend a long time wandering through a store searching for a specific product.
Yeah, that's great. And like when you mentioned like the H&M as a social space, it reminded me. I forget which exact brand it was, but I think it was a platform, Decentraland. Like you could buy a can of this beverage, and you end up receiving a voucher on your email to claim a physical good of the same brand. I think like that those kind of like virtual but also physical like hybrid advertising where like yes you socialize in this branded metaverse world, but if you make a digital purchase you can also reclaim it claim it physically, like creates this very interesting hybrid experiences where as the metaverse tries to blur the lines between physical and digital, you get the similar experience too in this type of advertising.
That seemed most one of the most compelling features about NFTs in kind of peak NFT space last year, were NFTs that offered some real world good, club membership, that kind of thing, along with the digital asset. I have to say, I'm very skeptical of the sort of digital twin store concept. Obviously, the capacity for embodiment in VR is very powerful, and like the way we embody our physical form in the real world and can interact with things. But I worry that from that there's a kind of cascade towards just recreating the physical world in VR. And obviously the stores we visit when we go to the mall are the product of all kinds of physical and commercial constraints that just don't exist in VR. Real estate is not expensive in the same way. Building materials do not cost what they do. And so while putting a water slide in your mall store might be outlandish, putting one in your VR store or allowing users to fly between kiosks rather than physically walking the aisles seems preferable, or at least worth comparing pairwise, rather than gluing a digital shopping cart to your hand and sending you into the grocery store.
Yeah, you just mentioned that. Imagine we're talking if it can be the physical retail retail version. Is like if you tell me I don't have to go across the mall to go to the opposite escalator to go up, and I can just fly to the store. Maybe it can be superior in some ways.
Yeah.
So I want to shift the conversation a little bit to more like policy ground questions, and one you already mentioned. I think a major topic is like one of the major concerns in the space is the introduction of eye tracking tech, and in general, this overall concern about how AR VR devices could potentially allow companies to infer data and make assumptions about our core beliefs, our likes, or our health. And those expressing these concerns claim that if we pair this data with other powerful tools like, say, AI, we could have like a race to the bottom where companies try to collect even more data and like a general erosion of user privacy. And on one side, we cannot dispose of these technologies, especially with something like eye tracking. Like it's necessary to power valuable features like foveated rendering or controller-less device control for a more immersive experience. And also, like on the other side, you generally have the case that data-driven advertisement is better for users. Like they get ads for the things they actually care about, or small businesses that like when they invest their scarce marketing money, they get a huge return on investment compared to just advertisement that is not driven by data at all. So do you think like platforms and how hardware devs can nail that balance between privacy and innovation? Like, and how do you know if like any advertisers are actually considering using this inferred data? Is there any industry kind of conduct and self-regulation that could address these concerns, or should it be is there any like legislation to be looking out for in terms of data privacy that could address these concerns?
Yeah, I think in the absence of clear laws and regulations, platforms and developers should really abide by some of the existing principles and frameworks that are already out there to guide their actions. So the XR Safety Initiative, for example, offers policy frameworks for safety and privacy in the industry, really drawing on existing laws, such as the EU's GDPR. I think it's also really important and excellent practice to adhere to privacy by default to ensure that users' profile settings are automatically set to the most, privacy-friendly setting. Um, transparency and disclosure are also very important for platforms in striking this balance between privacy and innovation. When users understand how their data is being collected and shared, I think that they can really make informed decisions about the information they choose to share, either directly or through opt-in and opt-out mechanisms. And to go even deeper, I think that users should be made aware of the information that can be inferred from the data that they provide and how that's ultimately used. But with this said, the US at the government level does have some existing frameworks in place for privacy that offer a foundation for addressing privacy and ads in immersive environments. There is the proposed American Data Privacy and Protection Act that if Congress is able to come together and pass the bill, it can set a really good framework or really good foundation. But even with a federal privacy law, I'm not sure that it will fully address some of the novel challenges that AR and VR present. Privacy law concerning these technologies has to really consider the different types of information that these devices are collecting and create safeguards to protect users from these harms. Uh, Users, using AR and VR are constantly generating data while interacting with these immersive environments. And I'm not sure that the current bill is nuanced enough to really deal with that. But I do think that it's a good place to start. And sort of going back to your initial question, I don't think that policymakers and industry should work in silos on this issue, especially if we want to get at the heart of these concerns. Policymakers are going to need the technical expertise of people in the industry, to create laws that strike that balance between privacy and innovation.
Yeah, Will, I don't know if you want to chip in. I know like you and Kate in general has also done a lot of work on data-driven advertising and algorithmic advertising. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I really try to separate the new from old challenges here. Though new and old doesn't necessarily mean less or more concerning. To me, geolocative data is already extremely leaky. We have problems with the apps on our cell phones, with our cars, with metro transit systems, all gathering information about where we go throughout the day and storing it or reselling it, often in very insecure methods or frameworks. And so while if we're all wandering around with network connected AR glasses, then you have a similar, or maybe in some cases magnified, geolocative data concern. The same sorts of bills or restrictions which we've failed to pass or impose in the past are, exactly what would cover that kind of misuse or resale of geolocative data. So I think that's a political problem beyond really AR, VR, and other emerging technologies, and is as much tied in telcos as anything else. However, there are new, genuinely novel data concerns. One that looms large for me is the kind of in-home mapping that a lot of AR and VR headsets do in order to create either rendered versions of your home environment or allow you to navigate your home in a wireframe fashion while you're in VR. And that's a sort of data or information that we didn't see being collected en masse before. Obviously, we might take photos inside our home, but in terms of taking a entire layout, and in some cases, patterns of daily use when we're talking about always on devices, that's new, and we may need to accommodate potentially unforeseen misuses of that sort of thing. Now, I do, as with the geolocative data, I think it is often hard to anticipate how it may be misused ahead of time. And so even the best designed sort of preemptive regulations end up covering harms that don't end up manifesting while missing the harms that malicious users come up with over time. So that's worth looking out for.
Yeah, and I wanted to pull in that thread when you mentioned like geolocative data and like how we have like different applications collecting different types of data and different management of it. I think like without having to go super futuristic, as you mentioned, like to wait until like the AR, VR enabled wearables are all about. We just look at AR enabled smartphone apps, and these features are typically deployed in a company's dedicated app, and like these apps are the ones collecting and processing spatial data needed to enable this AR functionality. Which means like instead you have like this like archipelago of islands of different data practices, different data like cybersecurity standards and protocols, and means that each company that deploys one of these tools has like take into account this, and we have like different standards. So like this translating to higher potential risk of location data leaks, like as you were mentioning, as we will have different data protection practices among these companies, or could it also be a way for like companies to compete and because they're not tied to advertising like other social media companies, they're able to more safely secure and has less incentive to sell this data?
I don't think that it directly translates into higher risk of sensitive location data leaking for users. I think that this depends on the overall practices of companies. Do they prioritize security and privacy and take measures to ensure that the personal and sensitive data of their users are protected? Do they have the capacity to keep up with the massive amounts of data they're collecting? Do they practice good cyber hygiene and privacy hygiene? Are their employees trained on these issues? And without such components in place, I think that increases the risk of data leaks for their users. This is one of the many reasons as to why I think we need to see a concerted effort from companies using this technology to use, as I mentioned earlier, some of the existing principles and data governance frameworks to guide their actions and operations, and to always adhere to a gold standard, even if there isn't a federal data privacy law in place or whatever that might look like in the future. But even with this said, right, data leaks can happen to even the most well-prepared companies. So if and when breaches do occur, it's extremely important that companies follow a strict process for documenting the leak, disclosing the information to users and regulators where appropriate. But I think that ultimately does further highlight the need for federal privacy legislation to ensure that data privacy is handled consistently across companies, even if AR is operating from different apps run by different companies.
So I want to move for like outside from privacy and talk a lot more ad disclosure practices and potential regulation, and because that's another issue that's constantly garnered attention in the space. It's like how advertising in the metaverse could in some way be more difficult to discern advertised content from organic content in a metaverse setting. For example, there are claims that with the advancement of AI, like a metaverse platform could, in a matter of seconds, introduce some virtual avatar like characters on my side that might seem to be having a genuine conversation, but in reality, they're making a sales pitch paid by an advertiser. I'll just say that like the Pepsi can in the picnic table, like as Will was mentioning, like just a can of soda, it could be inserted into my field of view as a user, which is essentially a product placement that is often done in TV and movies. But there could be a claim that a user could not be able to tell if the object was placed there because someone paid for it to be there. So if technology eventually evolves to be able to make that a possible reality, do you believe that existing ad disclosure guidelines that already are applicable to 2D social media are they easily applicable in the metaverse? Are those enough to curtail these concerns, or should they be updated? Oh, well, I think you might be muted. Or
Sorry.
yeah.
To me, looking at the current online landscape, I think it's both an issue, but not one I'm terribly concerned about, in that current sort of 2D social media disclosure laws do not seem to be strictly followed. You have all kinds of competing jurisdictions, Instagram influencers and the like failing to disclose that they've been paid to promote products seems like a persistent problem, but one which communities have developed norms for dealing with. And we bring a hopefully healthy level of skepticism to what we see online. I have no way of telling if the Reddit post I'm reading was written as part of a paid promotion or just organic. And so I bring a certain skepticism to online product reviews. I think it really remains to be seen when or even if we will get to the level of fidelity that makes some of this kind of product placement very concerning. Right now, the sorts of VR environments or social spaces that we have access to just aren't terribly convincing, I think. If you can get to the point where I can feel like I am holding a can of Coke in my hand and flipping the tab and hear that crisp pop as I do, maybe I'll be more worried. But right now I'm a legless avatar kind of gesturing at things. And frankly, from an immersion standpoint, some of that product placement can be valuable or enjoyable to users. I've always been struck by the sort of lack of realistic product placement in most video games. You get generic brand colas or the Burger Town restaurant rather than Burger King, I think in large part because the licensing deals to feature this content in VR where users can manipulate it or perhaps alter the context in which it's placed has been in the past very concerning to brands and advertisers. And so unless that changes, and I think again in VR users will have more opportunities to misuse the Burger King location, do something lewd or inappropriate there and put Burger King off, such that brands may be hesitant in some cases to really put their real products or IP in front of users to play with.
And I do want to add to that a bit. I think that the framework is in place, right? It might be an issue, seems like, of enforcement action, right? Actually making sure that people are adhering to some of these disclosure mechanisms that are in place, right? It's just generally speaking, looking at the FTC's Act, which prohibits unfair and deceptive acts or practices, broadly covers advertising claims, marketing, promotional activities, and isn't limited to any particular medium. And we see a lot of other disclosure guidelines issued by the FTC. The .com disclosures come to mind, for instance, right, making sure that people have clear and conspicuous disclosure when they are advertising, and there isn't a clear formula for what that looks like. So I think that there is a need for additional guidance, perhaps even more clear guidance, because existing guidance is quite broad, and perhaps there is a need for more enforcement to make sure that people are actually abiding by some of what's already out there.
Yeah, and I think and bringing forward like the case that Will mentioned, I think it'd be important when the metaverse platforms become bigger and like this becomes maybe a bigger issue. It's like this thing for like the enforcing deceptive practices by Instagram influencer that by the platform itself. I think we've seen some good level of compliance by content introduced by platforms, like in the case of the concern of the inserted avatar having this conversation. I think the liability for platforms to not disclose that the ads the avatars placed are placed by an ad could be particularly more risky than the money they could take from that ad. So I think like in that sense, I like Ilma was saying, like I think enforcing that is going to be relatively easy, while like you have this other under the table agreements, which are going to be way more complicated if you have like Instagram influencers, or in this case, Horizon Worlds or VR chat influencers or work creators not disclosing advertised content. That might be more difficult to prove, but
yeah. And to be fair, the FTC seems to be looking into modernizing its .com disclosures to address some of the new advertising practices that we are seeing. So I think the existing guidance dates back to like 2013, but the agency is definitely like really seeking to catch up with some of the technological and societal advancements that are occurring in the advertisement realm.
yeah, so before we continue with our questions, I want to remind the audience that you can send your questions for Q&A via Slido, the link down below in the YouTube description, the ITIF website. And I want to pivot to another touchy subject that has been kids in the metaverse and kids advertising in particular, because currently most of the metaverse or VR platforms are heavily targeted 18 plus year old crowd. But some of the most successful metaverse or metaverse adjacent platforms like Roblox, Minecraft, or Fortnite have predominantly teenage populations. So looking back and taking some of the lessons from the social media experience, platforms are currently at a crossroads. If you want to invite younger demographics, particularly kids under 13, into platforms, will translate into stricter regulations and restrictions that over what platforms can and can't do, which introduce practical and financial challenges. How do you think platforms can navigate that crossroads where they might face pressure to include the demographics in the platform, but also addressing those concerns about advertising to kids and teenagers? Oh, well, I think you agree.
Sitting at the nexus of the sort of gaming space and social media spaces does just create a difficulty in separating children from adults. Our norms, if not laws, of internet use have always accepted a certain amount of presence of children in online games, even when it might be seen as non-age appropriate. Again, children playing Call of Duty alongside adults, and nobody seems to bat an eye. But if they're on Instagram, that's much more concerning to us. And so VR, in bringing these spaces together, faces that challenge in a real way from the get-go. I think at the hardware level is probably the best way or place to attempt to divide or separate children from adults and then delineate their access to different virtual spaces. Unlike the Xbox or physical desktop computer, the sort of biometric information that a headset can assess, from height to interpupillary distance, can be very helpful in determining a user's age. Now, obviously, that isn't foolproof, but it is a set of signals that we don't have in the same way when in the traditional console or PC gaming environment. So I think there's room for improvement or delineation there, but it will be a persistent problem. I think in many cases, the issue cuts both ways. A lot of the sort of harassment concerns that I've seen or heard so far in VR social spaces often involve children or teenagers harassing adults. And so I think, the full breadth of the problem is worth appreciating on all sides. It's not just children being exposed to non-age appropriate content that they don't intend to see.
Yeah, and I think what I'm going to say is going to echo a lot of Will's comments, in that I think first and foremost, it's really important for platforms to get age verification right in order to create these child-friendly experiences. Online platforms really need to identify which users are actually children. Many current online services use an age gate, asking a user to enter, their birthday to determine their age, but this has, very clear limitations. But I think that platforms are definitely taking steps in the right direction in this Web 2.0 environment. Meta, for example, is testing new options for people to verify their age on Instagram. But I don't think there's any major platform that I at least can point to and say that they've perfected age verification. Kids are quite smart and are figuring out ways to circumvent some of these methods. And as Will mentioned, there is an opening for biometric data potentially that is collected through headsets to make age verification easier, but this is obviously quite challenging. But I do think that once age verification is gone right, it creates an avenue for platforms to get children's advertising rights, advertising right. And again, Will talked about this a bit in terms of, platforms will be able to have confidence platforms who have confidence in the ages of their users can create tiered restrictions for advertising, right? Whether that's making it so that children under 13 don't see any immersive ads at all. But I think that there's possibly even a role for platforms in assuming some of the responsibility in educating their youngest users about advertising and how they can work out the differences between products and strategies that are used to sell to them. So essentially, helping them learn the difference between advertising messages and other media messages that are designed to entertain or educate. And this sort of training can occur before they're even allowed onto the platform, so that from an early age, we're training our kids on how to make these critical discernments.
Yeah.
I would just add that I think beyond the age gating itself, platforms can do a lot of good in setting norms and often overlook this. Back in the 90s, we had fairly robust children's spaces online, websites like Neopets, where children could socialize with one another. These were understood as not places for adults, and if you were an adult there, you would be called out. I think platforms can do a lot in constructing physical environments, skywriting, a child catcher wandering around, that help to set and then allow players to enforce the norms in separating adult from children spaces in VR.
Yeah, 100%. Like, and I think like it's part of the generation, like a Neopets, Club Penguin. Like it's, I think it's a lot of that can be drawn from there. Like, oh, what made this platform successful and generally accepted as acceptable product for kids. So I want to move to Q&A part, and I want to remind our audience to keep sending questions. But you have a question from the audience it says, what opportunities would governments have in the augmented reality space with limited budgets, but that have large populations they want to reach, such as voters, youth, seniors, etc.? Will or Gama, who wants to go tackle that first?
I don't know if Will, you want to take it first, or I can take a crack at it.
Well, I think we've gotten a really good example of what not to do from the EU this or last week, in which they created this global gateway beach party in VR that apparently cost $400,000 and was attended by about 13 people. Trying to create boutique experiences in general as either a government or a marketer, I think is much harder than simply meeting people where they already are in VR. For the most part, as good as your idea or cause may seem to be, if that's all there is in a virtual space, it's going to be hard to attract the critical mass of users necessary for anything communal or really interactive. But that pitfall seems to be repeated over and over.
Yeah, even in our metaverse study, we conducted a survey, about evaluated the use cases that, people want to use AR and VR technologies, or what they want to experience in the metaverse. And some of the top use cases were things like training, health, and shopping. But people didn't really seem inclined to interact with, their government. Actually, what we found was that people had, at least in the U.S. context, had less trust in their government than they did in some of the tech companies. So this will be a very, very challenging. I think there's also a question about how do we make sure that AR and VR technologies are used widely, right? There are a lot of practical challenges around that, including the fact that, people in the US are quite segregated between those who live in rural areas and have connectivity issues and those who live in urban areas and may be able to, access these platforms more easily. So that's also something that governments need to be able to think about and navigate.
On that training point, I think that does open up some interesting avenues for governments or government employee offices to bring citizens in to the inner workings of government or emergency response training in ways that they couldn't previously, either because of cost or safety concerns. I've seen a number of VR police use of force training simulators. And that's something where I think it would be quite productive for the local police department to invite VR users to come in and join that scenario with them, both to see how they're trained to react to things, to understand how the police seek to use this tool. And you can imagine that with other, emergency services. Even kids who are thinking about becoming surgeons, following surgeons through VR training in a way that they aren't going to bring them into the operating theater anymore.
Yeah, so I want to pivot back a little bit and go on this. One of these comments we're making is like we talked about how digital world can vastly improve over the physical. For example, like we're not bounded by the laws of physics, or like how they can make them more enjoyable when you explore the spaces in digital space. But I think, in thinking back on that example, I think there can be scenarios where AR VR makes the physical world better, and it's, for example, you can downsize a store if you have a magic mirror, like an AR mirror, and you wear a model shirt, and essentially you have a shirt that is your green screen, and you can just, you can, as Will said, with clothing, you can test the feel, you can test the heftiness, but maybe you want to try one pattern, and then or different colors, and they might not have like this one in store, but it's like no, just try it on the mirror, and then you buy it online, and you can have more downsized stores and potentially have better custom. Shopping experiences. Do you think this might be like a real possibility in the future, and do you think it can improve the public spaces that we shop at in retail?
I do think so. I think that a lot of the reason or why people are using AR in the retail space. So let me rephrase this. I think that there's a strong correlation between AR usage and specific purchase types, right? People are using AR so customers who have never purchased AR from like a specific product or an online site are more likely to use AR as a tool to help reduce some of the purchase anxiety that they may experience. When customers are unfamiliar with, let's say, a product category, they rely more on AR to reduce the risk of making a potentially disappointing purchase. And if something is particularly expensive, they're going to leverage AR more to make riskier purchases. And so this would definitely reduce the need for people to actually have to physically go, like, let's say, into the store to experience these things, because they're more likely to like just buy run-of-the-mill items without needing to leverage AR tools. But for these very specific kind of like purchase types, they will use AR, right? And so that may actually make them not go into the store as frequently because they're like, oh, I have more confidence in this item, I'm just going to purchase it, creating an avenue for stores to ultimately, downsize.
Yeah, I think while there's some relationship between, the cost of real estate, the amount of physical product you need to display, and the likelihood of using AR as an alternative, a lot of the uses we've seen so far involve essentially firms, marketers getting access to space that they've already given up or traded away. You think about the virtual driving experiences for cars. Most car dealerships are located where lots of people are, generally denser environments. You might not have the, perfect roads of Galway by a sea cliff around to drive on. But if you can allow users to virtually drive the car they're trying out in such a place, then you gain the benefit of being located in that physical location without the trade-offs of actually doing so. And so far, it seems more like reaching for even more space or more interesting spaces than physically downsizing what you have. But again, as the technology improves, I think the amount of space that you might actually need will, yes, shrink.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And like what you mentioned, like the capacity to have more information and like avoid that buyer's remorse. I think that's something that has powered a lot of like the implementation of AR powered marketing in makeup. Like people trying to sort out if the concealer they're buying actually matches the tone of the skin, or if the lipstick they're buying is actually the color they want. I think it's been a very powerful tool, and indeed, like it's sometimes when we think AR VR, we just think of the digital space and exclusively in that realm, but it can also help us enhance the physical world and be more aware of what we're buying and prevent those disappointments.
I think there may be some interesting questions between truth in advertising and sort of fidelity and even hardware or render quality down the road, thinking about that pigmentation and the makeup you're putting on. You'll deal with claims that things looked better in VR on the VR model, and then the poor Wish-like product or whatever arrives and it doesn't look as good as it did in VR. And that's something we'll have to work through. We've been there with catalogs or the hamburger that they put up on the advertisement rather than the weak patty you end up with before. But I'm sure we'll go through it all again with AR VR market.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point.
Yeah, I had not thought about that. Like that's an interesting question. Like how are we going to be able to deal with like deceptive advertising? Like at one point, it's like a credible, like a virtual image. Is that like something that users are credibly inclined to believe it and take at face value, or and as you mentioned before, like those social norms of what the expectations are going to be key, because I think like that's going to shape a lot of the future regulation on the topic. So I think we're reaching our time. I mean, thank you so much, guys, for Will and Goma being here. It was always a pleasure to talk with you, and just want to remind our followers to follow the ITIF social media, YouTube channel. Will, Goma, thank you once again so much. To revisit this conversation, you will find the full recording on an ITIF's YouTube channel. To keep up with ITIF's latest insight into AR, VR tech policy and other tech policy discussions, make sure you follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and all the social media. Have a good day.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.